Every tale that rose from the dust of the West carried its own shadow, and the darkest parts were never spoken around the fire. It was not about the silver coins men chased, nor about the pistols that flashed at sundown, but about the silence that settled inside a soul once the world had broken him. In the town of Red Creek, people spoke of Elias Turner in low voices, as if he were half here and half gone. He had once worn the badge of a ranger, had once known the weight of love in his arms, and then watched the earth swallow it whole when the woman he cherished was buried beneath it. After that, he moved through his days like a figure carved from smoke, tending his land, answering no one, a man waiting without hope. They said he was a widower who lived more with ghosts than with neighbors. They said the fields around his cabin looked like graves themselves, dry and unwilling to give him anything in return. They said he kept his head down, his eyes lowered, and his voice locked deep in his chest. To the people of Red Creek, Elias Turner had become nothing more than a rumor of grief walking under the sun. But there was something the whispers never carried. His story had not ended where everyone thought it had. His life had not been buried in the same ground as his wife. The moment of change came suddenly, on a day when he had not sought it. A woman stood on a wagon in the center of town, bound, displayed, her spirit meant to be broken. To others she was nothing, a stranger to be traded, another spectacle to fill an empty afternoon. To Elias she became a spark, one that forced his silent heart to beat again. From the instant he stepped forward and laid down a coin, his path shifted. He had not purchased a companion, nor a servant, nor a name in the gossip of the town. He had purchased a burden, a duty, and a fire that would burn the rest of his days. What no one knew then was simple. In reaching for that rope, and breaking the ties that held her, Elias Turner had also broken the chains around his own silence. He had unknowingly bought more than a woman. He had bought himself into a war, a battle not fought with rifles in the mud of old fields, but in the raw, unforgiving space between two souls learning to stand against the world together. And from that day on, the man they had called a ghost would carry a story heavier than any bullet. The fairground of Red Creek lay under a hard sun that baked the dirt into cracked lines like scars across the earth. Wagons rattled in and out, horses stamped, children clung to their mothers' skirts, and the smell of sweat and whiskey mixed with dust that never seemed to settle. In the center of the square, above the noise, a single wagon stood apart. On its bed, a woman swayed unsteadily, her ankles raw from rope and her feet stained dark with blood that had soaked into the wooden boards. Torn cloth clung to her body, more rag than dress, and a sack covered her head, reducing her to something faceless, nameless, less than human in the eyes of those gathered. Her hands were bound in front of her, held stiff like she had been nailed to her own shame. Silas Boone, heavy-set and red-faced from drink, worked the crowd with the practiced swagger of a man who had long traded in cruelty. His boots stamped, his voice rang loud, and his smirk widened each time the onlookers jeered. He knew how to stir them, to make the sight into entertainment, to make suffering into a game. Coins flashed, and laughter swelled with each shouted bid. Men with calloused hands and sunburned necks pushed closer, their eyes lit not with mercy but with hunger for ownership. Boys too young to shave mimicked their elders, hooting and pointing, their laughter thin and cruel. Women stood on the edges, arms crossed, saying nothing, but their silence was its own weight. The crowd's words turned sharp, cutting through the air. They called her savage, cursed her as wild, less than worthy of a name. They laughed as if they were watching a carnival trick. But beneath the sack, though they could not see it, her body held still not from weakness but from something else, resistance, or maybe pride that had not yet been stripped away. At the far edge of the square, Elias Turner stood apart. His frame was lean from years of hard labor, his hat shadowing eyes that had seen too much. He had not come for spectacle, but the noise had drawn him like a moth to flame, unwilling though he was. And when he saw her on that wagon, the memories struck him like bullets from the past. He remembered mud thick with blood at Shiloh and Chickamauga, remembered boys crying for their mothers with lungs filling fast with water and red earth. He had known the horror of battle, the stink of death when the sun rose on fields of silence. Yet as he watched the wagon, a deeper sickness coiled in him, for this was not war's madness. This was cruelty chosen, cruelty celebrated, cruelty wrapped in the laughter of neighbors. The bidding rose, and Boone's voice grew louder, enjoying the game. Elias's heart hammered like a drum he had once marched to, but his body stayed still, hands curled tight at his sides. He should have turned away. That was what a man like him was supposed to do, walk back to his land, keep his head down, let the town rot in its own meanness. But then the woman stumbled, her knees weakening for only a moment, a faint shiver in her body that spoke of exhaustion and shame. It was small, almost invisible, but to Elias it was louder than any shout in the square. His voice, when it came, was quiet, flat, and carried no drama. He named the price, just a single word that cut through the noise like a knife through cloth. The crowd froze, their laughter silenced as if struck dumb all at once. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the restless shifting of horses and the dry wind sweeping through the square. Faces turned toward him, surprise flashing in eyes that had expected only sport, not interruption. Boone's smirk grew moot. The sight of fear in her eyes unsettled him in a way he had not expected. She was no longer stone, no longer an untouchable figure of silence and fire. She was human, vulnerable, fragile in that moment, alive in a way that demanded recognition. The storm raged on, the cabin creaking under its assault, but Elias no longer listened to the wind or the thunder. He saw only her, standing in his home for the first time, not as a prisoner of silence, not as a shadow, but as a woman made real by the simple truth of fear. A week passed and Red Creek seemed to grow smaller with every whisper that passed through its streets. Elias felt it in the way eyes lingered when he rode into town for supplies, and the way voices dropped when he walked past the saloon, and the way silence thickened when he turned his back. The story spread faster than dust in the wind. The ghost farmer had taken in a woman from the auction, not as a servant, not as property, but as something else. The word wife traveled in half-mocking tones, as though the town had been given a new kind of entertainment, a tale to pass from one mouth to another. Elias kept his head low, but he knew the weight of rumor often carried more danger than truth. The afternoon came hot and dry, the sky washed pale with sun, when he saw the line of dust rising on the horizon. Four riders moved steadily toward the farm, their silhouettes cut sharp against the glare. Elias recognized the figure at the front before he saw the face. Boone rode with his back straight, shoulders squared with the confidence of a man who believed the land bent beneath his boots. The others followed close, their rifles slung loose, their mouths already set in smirks Elias did not need to see to know. They came into the yard without pause, horses stamping, dust swirling around the porch. Boone dismounted first, the leather creaking, his boots crunching against the dry earth as he walked forward. His grin was wide and empty, the kind of smile that carried no warmth. His voice came smooth, dripping with mockery, as he called out to Elias, greeting him like an old friend though nothing in the tone spoke of friendship. He tossed his words like knives, cutting into the rumors, framing Elias not as a man but as a fool clinging to something he had no right to claim. He spoke of stolen goods, of property paraded as pride, of a woman that had once been sold and could be taken again just as easily. His hand lingered at his belt, not yet drawing, but resting there with the quiet threat of violence, as though daring Elias to speak against him. Elias stood steady, his shadow long across the dust. His answer came firm, not loud, not desperate, but steady as the ground beneath him. He spoke of her not as a possession, not as a burden, but as his wife. The word carried no performance, no theater. It was spoken plain, as though truth needed no sharpening to cut. The riders laughed, their voices harsh in the dry air, their amusement brittle with cruelty. To them, it was a joke, a claim they believed could be crushed under heel like a stray weed. Boone's smirk twisted into something darker, his hand sliding lower along the leather strap at his waist, the tension coiling tight in the air as if the land itself held its breath. Then the cabin door opened. Naomi stepped out, her bare feet silent on the porch boards, her figure framed by the shadowed doorway. She carried no weapon, spoke no word, but her presence alone shifted the weight of the moment. She moved to Elias's side and stood beside him, not behind, not apart, but beside, her shoulders squared, her head lifted high. There was no tremor in her stance, no trace of submission. The same fire that had burned in her eyes on the day of the auction blazed again, but now it was steadied by something more, something unbroken that no man in that yard could claim to own. Boone saw it, though he would never speak of it. He saw in her what he had not seen in any of the faces on the block, what he had not expected to find on this quiet farm. It was not defiance alone, nor pride alone, but the unshakable truth that he could not break her. The laughter faltered on the rider's lips, turning brittle as Boone spat into the dirt, his curse bitter, his smirk curdled into something smaller. With a sharp tug at his reins, he swung back onto his horse, turning his back on the porch with a bitterness that cut deeper than any wound. The riders wheeled their horses, the dust rising thick as they rode off toward the horizon, leaving the yard quiet once more. The silence that settled was not the heavy, unspoken kind that had haunted Elias for years. It was a silence that carried strength, forged not in words but in the simple act of standing together. That night the cabin lay in silence, but it was not the hollow, suffocating quiet that had once filled the rooms. This silence carried warmth, alive wit. The presence of two souls who had chosen, in their own unspoken way, to remain. The storm had passed, Boone had ridden off, yet the echo of what had happened lingered in the air like embers refusing to die. Elias sat at the table, his hands resting still, listening to the faint sounds of Naomi moving in the loft above. Each step she made seemed to remind him that he was no longer alone, that the house which had been a tomb for years now carried breath again. The seasons turned as they always did, but something in their rhythm felt different. Spring arrived with green shoots breaking through soil that had once seemed barren, as though the earth itself had been waiting for a reason to live again. Naomi worked beside Elias in the fields, her hands steady, her strength quiet but undeniable. Summer burned hot and long, and he noticed the way she did not shy from the heat or the endless labor, as if hardship were an old companion she no longer feared. When autumn came, the harvest was fuller than he had dared hope, and he saw in her the satisfaction of building rather than merely surviving. Winter, once a season of dread, became a time of shared labor and quiet evenings by the fire, the silence between them no longer empty but filled with an unspoken bond. Elias felt the shadow of the grave where his wife had been laid grow lighter with each passing day. The memory did not vanish, nor did the ache fully fade, but it no longer crushed him into the ground. Naomi had not replaced what he had lost. Instead, she had given him a reason to rise from the weight of it. He found himself speaking more, not to the air as before, but to her, sharing thoughts that had long been buried in silence. She did not always answer, but when she did, her words came measured and strong, shaping the cabin into more than walls and a roof. It became a home. Naomi, too, changed. The stranger who had once stood on a wagon in rags, eyes burning with defiance, no longer carried only fire. There was still steel in her gaze, but now it was tempered with trust. She was no longer simply the woman he had freed, nor the silent shadow in his barn. She became Naomi, fully herself, a presence that gave the farm life as much as the rain or the sun. She walked the land as though it had accepted her, and Elias could not remember when he had stopped seeing her as a stranger. And if one believed the West was nothing but dust, blood, and the echoes of gunfights, they had not stood where Elias and Naomi stood. The true West was never carved solely in the barrel of a rifle or the hunger for land. It was found in the quiet moments of endurance, in the strength to keep going when the world seemed determined to tear you apart. It was about learning who stood beside you when storms rose and enemies circled. It was about two souls, broken in different ways, daring to build something new from wreckage of what they had lost. In the end, the greatest lesson the land gave them was not how to fight, but how to live again. And though it frightened them both at times, that was the only battle worth winning.